All right. So again, for tonight's event or this afternoon's event, we'll be using the chat function as our main source of communication. So while using chat, make sure you set that little blue button from host and panelists to everyone so everybody can chat together. As a reminder, we're all here to learn something and have a good time, so let's be kind and courteous to one another. We're so excited to have you here. I want to welcome you to Flatiron School's What Do Job-Seeking Developers Need in Their GitHub? My name's Catherine Sommerfeld. I'm the Director of Marketing Campaigns and Events here at Flatiron School. And part of my team's job is hosting free introductory workshops like today's event to give you all the opportunity to meet some of our instructors, get a better feel of the Flatiron School experience. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our host for the afternoon, Alfie Akand. He is our Senior Curriculum Manager. Go ahead and take it away, Alfie.
Thanks, Catherine. Welcome, everyone. Like Catherine said, I'm Alvi. I'm the Senior Curriculum Manager at Flatiron School, which means I manage all of the curriculum that we're developing right now. So for my background, I studied electrical engineering with specializations in networking and microcontrollers. But while I was studying that, I really enjoyed the coding part of it, the coding aspect of it. So I started learning on my own, and then started working as a software engineer since my sophomore year. I worked at startups, worked on enterprise softwares, primarily backend, and I was a design director when I left the startup after we got Series A funding. Since then, I've been focusing more on teaching because I love teaching. I've been doing it since I was in like middle school, I want to say. So outside of work, I also host or co-host, I should say, meetup in New York where I teach data structures and algorithms. So and of course, I'm in NYC, if I didn't say it before, because everyone is saying in the chat where they're from. So let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. And while I'm doing that, just to reiterate, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat. I'll get to them during some of the presentation. And then towards the end of it, we'll also have a Q&A session. So I will try to answer all of the questions that we get. And I'm just moving around the Zoom overhead stuff here. Let me make the chat a bit bigger, and then we'll get started. All right, so what we're going to be talking today is about what do job-seeking developers need in their GitHub. So the primary reason that you may be interested in this is because a lot of recruiters these days do look at your GitHub, or some of the even more technical people that you may be interviewing with might be interested in your GitHub. And I'll talk more about the context in which they might look at your GitHub, and the level that you're applying at might play different roles depending on what sort of roles you're trying to do. So for example, if you're more of an entry-level engineer, then your GitHub will likely be more important than if you were to be a senior engineer. And I'll explain why that is towards the second half of this session, right? So the outline is fairly straightforward. I'll do a brief Git and GitHub review in case some of you aren't familiar with it. And then I'll talk about Git guidelines and GitHub guidelines. So one of the main ways to make your GitHub profile stand out is to have good Git practices for your account, right? So we'll start with that, and then we'll talk about how we can leverage the good GitHub practices along with the good GitHub practices to make a really good profile for yourself. All right. So we're going to start with the Git and GitHub review, and I'll keep it fairly simple. I won't go into like technical details, but I will talk about some resources towards the end, which you can use to learn more about these things, right? So what is Git, right? And to put it simply, Git is a way to manage the history of the code that you write, right? Let me make this less abstract and talk about something that everyone may be familiar with. So this is a Word document, right? With some text written on here. Okay, so if I were to make any changes in here, notice what happens, right? So for example, if I write Git is the best, right? A couple things happened here. Right? So the first is this change has been saved. So if I were to share this document with someone else, they would be able to read this updated value or the updated text. And then what we're going to do next is look at the version history, right? So remember I said it did a couple things. So the first thing it did was it saved the changes. The second thing it did is, let me zoom in a bit. The second thing it did was it created a version history. What this means is you can step back in time and see what changes has taken place in this file, right? And then second thing is, for this particular document, I'm the only author, but imagine if you had multiple authors for a document, right? It can happen, like books have multiple co-authors, right? So when that happens, this sort of history also keeps track of who is making the changes, along with when the changes were made. So what Git does is it basically allows you to do all of these things for the code that you write or the software that you develop, right? Does anyone have any questions at this point about Git? Feel free to add it in the chat and I'll answer them. So one of the main reasons why people love Git is, well, first of all, it's really, really fast. Second thing is it works locally. So in the past, there were some version control systems where you had to have access to the server itself, right? But Git, it works locally. And the way it works is, let's look at an example. So if I open this is simply an empty folder, right? GitHub for developers. There's nothing in here, okay? If I do git init, now this folder has become, a Git repository, right? What happens is there's a hidden folder in here, right? There's a hidden folder called .git. So which means if I share this directory or copy and send this directory over to anyone else, they'll get the exact same Git system that I'm working with, right? Or the exact same version, revisions, data logs that I have saved on their computer, right? So Git itself is the system or the tool that allows you to work with version control, or like make your software commits properly, so that way their history or their changes are recorded, right? And so where does GitHub come into all of this? So Git itself doesn't have a mechanism to share things, right? Like you can copy over directories and then send them over to other people to work with, but you need a proper system in place to sync information with multiple people, right? So before I talk about how Git comes into play, I have one question. So can someone tell me how many lines popular software have? So for example, you're using a browser. So for example, I'm using Firefox. You may be using Safari or Chrome. How many lines of code do you think there is for these software? Okay, thousands, hundred thousands, millions. Okay, awesome. So we get a lot of answers. Let's look at a visualization and trillions. Well, trillion is a lot of code. Let's see what happens. So this is hundreds of thousands, right? It seems like simpler software used to have a few thousand lines of code, right? Let's go down a bit, right? It seems jet planes have 1.7 million lines. That's fine. Let's scroll down all the way to the bottom, right? Let's see how big some of these can get, right? So operating systems, Windows Vista, it seems it has, what, 50 million lines of code. Right? These may be a bit outdated, but let's look at Google. Google has over 2 billion lines of code, and we're adding to it like every single day, right? So imagine having to work with billions of lines of code across multiple sub-organizations within a company, thousands of people working on same code bases sometimes, right? Totaling over millions of lines of code. So how do you manage all this complexity, right? This is where something like GitHub comes in. So GitHub is a platform that makes it easy for you to collaborate with people and make managing your software a bit easier, right? So for example, if I look at here, GitHub has all these features that you can use, right? I won't go into all of them, just a quick overview. You can share your repos and sync them using GitHub. You can automate tasks. So when you push some code onto GitHub, you can set automated testing so that you know that your software doesn't break when you deploy it to your users. And then you have your security. You can set up a bunch of security layers so not anyone can make changes to your code. You can actually deploy things on GitHub now as well. They've added project management features as well, where you can create like boards to keep track of who's supposed to do what, and then get a whole overview of how your repo is being developed, right? So I see some questions. So all of the websites that I'm talking about are linked in the slides, which I'll share. But the website I was using to show the lines of code is called informationisbeautiful.net. And then they have a visualization for the lines of code, right? And so that's about Git and GitHub. I won't go into the other features or how GitHub came to be. But if you're curious, you can always go on their website and look at their different features or their history. So now we're going to talk about Git guidelines, right? So I said Git is used for making changes or like keeping track of changes that you make to your code. So if you're making changes to millions of lines of code and working with thousands of other people, you need some form of convention, right? You need some convention so that things are consistent and you don't have to constantly reinvent the wheel, right? So what are the best practices around all of this, right? So the main thing is you need to make commits frequently, right? So when you make changes to text files like this, right? If I remove this, you'll notice that it's automatically saving, right? But if you're using Git, you have to manually save the changes that you make. You have to be deliberate in how you make the changes, when you make them, and what changes you make. So you have to commit frequently and make sure that there aren't large commits, meaning make sure you're not making large amounts of changes with each commit. Because what happens is once you make a commit, someone has to review it. Someone has to make sure that the commits don't break the production app. So if you make it easier for people to review your code, you're basically making the software more resilient, right? So it's less prone to human error. Okay. And then make sure you structure your commits consistently. What this means is there are some ways you can structure commits or every single commit so that it's more descriptive or it shows the intention behind those commits, right? These are some basic conventions that you may follow. I won't go over all of them. I just want you to know that it is there and you should be following conventions. The good thing is, depending on the company you work at, they will definitely have their own conventions. So you won't have to reinvent the wheel, or you won't have to come up with a system from scratch, right? If you're just working on your own personal repos, then you can just go to this website, which is called conventionalcommits.org, and then use these features or like these conventions for your personal projects. And that will make them look very professional, right? And so if you structure your commits, the one important part of structuring commits is making sure it's descriptive. So each commit has a subject and then the body description of what it does and why it does the thing that it's doing, or basically more context around the problem you're trying to solve and the solution that you have provided, right? So to that end, if you go here, this article does a good job of talking about how to write a really good commit message, right? Because not only will other people read your commits, sometimes you'll find yourself coming back to read your own commits. So make sure that you write descriptive commits and put in the necessary context around those commits, right? And so at this point, let me just look at the chat real quick for any questions, and then I'll move forward, right? Cool. So again, I have put some other resources towards the end of the slides, and I'll walk you through them in a bit, but these are just the foundations that you should follow. Commit frequently, structure your commits consistently, describe your commits properly, right? And now we're going to talk about GitHub guidelines. Now, before I talk about GitHub guidelines, I want to set the right context in which you might actually want to do this, right? So if you're making consistent Git commits, if you're writing descriptive messages, then you already have a pretty good base to stand on, right? So all the things or all the software that you push to GitHub or put on GitHub will have professional commit history, showing that you know how to use Git properly, right? So on top of that, why do we need to properly shape up our GitHub profile? So this is especially important for people who are just starting out in the field, because if you're an entry-level engineer, you may not have worked on large-scale projects for companies, right? So if that's the case, you have to show your potential employers that you have been coding, that you have been working on other sorts of projects, that you know how to use the technologies that you claim to know on your resume, right? So as an early stage engineer, or sometimes even mid-level engineers, you should have proper GitHub profiles. But as you get your first job and then more software jobs later on, you may have to use company-specific tools or private GitHub profiles, in which case you may not be able to show your progress, right? Which is what happens when you go to the senior level. Like at the senior level, your GitHub profile becomes less important, but when you're starting out, it's really important. So that's the context around why you should have a good GitHub profile, right? So the very first thing I want to highlight is your primary focus should be on developing projects and consistently practicing code, or like writing code, right? like you can have the best GitHub profile in the world, but if you don't have substantive projects to display your competencies, then it's not going to do much good, right? Which is why you should have at least maybe like 2 to 3 good projects and maybe one really good project that you constantly expand on or iterate on. What that means is, let's say you have started building a website, right? And let's say this website does like this website, it could be like a sales website, right? So if that's the case, maybe once you have built the first stage of the website, which are things like displaying things you can buy, the cart, and then the ability to purchase things. And then afterwards, you can iterate on it by building admin pages or additional user features, right? So if you have consistent development over time for a project, it shows the interviewer that you know how to work on bigger, more complex projects, right? So the kinds of projects you develop tell something or like shows your competencies to the people who are looking to recruit you, right? So with that out of the way, let's talk about how you can make your GitHub profile look better. So let's look at some examples just to show you. So this is a great repo. Repos are basically projects that you put on GitHub, right? So this is called the awesome GitHub profile README. And I want to show you like different variations of profiles. Like if I come in here, you can see that this person has a quick description or like quick bio of what they do, what they're interested in, and what technologies that they use. And then they have their GitHub stats on here, right? And if you click on this, they have all this information. So if a recruiter is looking at your GitHub profile, they can get all the necessary information that they need, right? So this is a good example of a repo. And then if you look on the sidebar, they have links to their website and then their email so that the recruiter can reach out to them immediately, right? Because if you don't put in contacts, the recruiters won't know how to reach out to you, right? Another one is this one. You can do a bunch of stuff with your profile, right? Here they have the contact right at the top, and then they have their projects that they want to highlight, and then they have their articles as well. And they have pinned repos, right? Pinned repos are basically repositories that you want to show off to potential recruiters, right? The project that you're most proud of, those should be pinned to the top, right? And notice this graph here. This graph shows you the commit history, or basically your activity on GitHub. So what recruiters generally do is they look for like 2 to 3 months of GitHub history or GitHub commit history. So that tells them that you have been practicing consistently and aren't just starting out, right? So how do you create a profile page? I would recommend starting out with a profile generator like this, right? So this is a GitHub profile generator. You can put in information and then it will generate a great profile for you. So what this looks like is this. It'll generate something like this for you, right? So you don't have to go through the trouble of figuring out how to exactly set these things up. You can just simply generate the profile using the automated generation tools, right? Which is what I would generally recommend that you start out with. And then later on, if you want, you can add other information or other flares in your profile if you want. Like this person has a dancing octocat here. You can do things like that if you're interested later. And then the second thing is, once your projects are pinned, you don't stop there, right? You need to showcase how to properly run your projects and what your projects actually do, right? So let's look at some examples. This is a project one of our students did, right? So if you notice here, it's taking a bit of time to load for some reason. So they have a video demo in here, which walks the person through the relevant features or the primary features of the application, because your recruiters won't have time to like download your software, install the necessary tools, and then run your application and then walk through it, right? They simply won't have the time for it. So you want to make sure that you have proper demos and then relevant pictures of how your app looks like when it's run, right? And obviously you should have some sort of information or instruction on how to run your application. And then you have the features themselves. Like, what do the features actually do, right? You can also put in GIFs if you want. And then you have all these features noted out here, right? So it is important to make sure you have a properly outlined README file, right? You want proper images, primary features, videos, and then instructions on how to run your application, right? And again, you can make your life a lot easier by using a README generator, right? If you come in here, it talks about what a README file is and how you should make the README file. And if you come in here, you can write the markup and then it automatically generates or like previews what it will look like on GitHub, right? And then they have all these amazing suggestions in here of what you should have in your repos. I would recommend looking at other open source repositories to see how they're structured as well, right? Some of them have really, really good documentation, right? Like the Git repo itself. So again, I want to reiterate the consistent commit history point. So make sure you're consistently working on projects to show potential recruiters that you are practicing regularly. So that way they know that the skills you have on your resume are actually there because you know them, not because you just wanted to get it past the automated bots, right? So it is important to make sure you have a consistent commit history, right? And then I want to talk about some resources because I think I saw some questions around learning Git or how to or some of the links. I guess some people were asking about different links in the chat as well, right?
I've been dropping a lot of those links in too, Alec,
yeah,
as we're going.
Right. So the first thing I would recommend is learning Git properly. So as a developer, you probably don't need or won't need a lot of the more advanced Git features, right? So to that end, I would recommend that you start here, right? Either here or here. Both of these are great tutorials. The official Git documentation does have amazing resources. Like they have an entire book, which is like absolutely amazing. But they also have these short videos that go over what Git is and what it does. And because this is the official Git documentation, this is where you can come to get the most up-to-date information, right? But to get started, I would recommend doing something like this, right? Which is a guided tutorial on how to install Git, how to use it, and the general workflows that you may be familiar with, right? So you can see here that they go through all the common processes, the common commands, and the common workflows in this guided tutorial, right? Right. And this here, this is just for reference. If you're curious about some of the ways that Git actually works, it's not necessary for you to start using Git, right? It's just here in case someone is curious and they want to find out more about how Git works, right? Yeah, so Git is a tool that allows you to keep track of the changes you're making to your code. GitHub is the website where you host your code, right? Where you put the code from your local computer, and then everyone else can access it from GitHub. Not only that, GitHub has recently started allowing things like automation, project management, even deployments. So you can actually host websites on GitHub as well, right? So hopefully that clarifies the difference between Git and GitHub. And then if after you've learned Git, you should learn how to make proper Git commit messages. These are the two resources that I mentioned earlier that you should go through, right? And then on this page, I have the GitHub profile overview examples where you can look at the different ways people have made their GitHub profile, and you can find a unique profile that works for you, right? And then there's the generator I mentioned, some examples on GitHub documentation, and then finally the README generator, right? So to round this off, I would recommend that you focus on building out projects. But as you're building out projects, make sure you're following the best practices for Git, and make sure your GitHub is properly documented and cleaned up for potential employers, right? So with that said, I think we're ready to do the Q&A session. I will start going through the chat right now to pick out questions. And then if you have more questions, feel free to ask them in the chat, and then I'll get to them, right? So let's see.
We do have one in the Q&A that's also in the chat, Alvi, that a couple of people seem interested in.
Okay. So I see the Q&A, right? Okay. Ken asks, regarding recruiters looking for 2 to 3 months of GitHub activity, must that activity be a mix of all 4 types, pull requests, code review, issues, and commits, or is one type more noteworthy than the others? All right, excellent question. So what do recruiters look for when they're going through your commit history, right? So depends on the kinds of recruiter they are and what stage of the interview you're in, right? So for example, if it's in the early stages, it's more likely that a non-technical recruiter might be looking at your commit history, at which point they may not care exactly what type of commits you have, right? So it could all be pull requests, for example, and not creating issues or doing reviews, things like that, right? But in the latter stages of the interview, or if you're working with a technical recruiter, they might be wondering what sort of commits you're making, right? At which point they'll look at your commit history, what commits you were making, how you were making them, and things like that. So I've heard a few different things from different senior recruiters or like senior engineers who are on the hiring team or hiring managers, if you will. Because some of my friends are on hiring managers or hiring teams, and I used to be on hiring teams as well. So generally what happens is there are two types of or two kinds of projects that they look out for. One is a complex project that you have worked on consistently for a long period of time, let's say 1 to 2 months, where you're continuously adding features or refining a project that you have already built. So for example, let's say you have built an application, but it doesn't have all the unit tests. So you refine it by adding more tests. You refine its performance. You add new features, right? And you're doing all of this to one project over like several months, let's say. And that shows that you can work on really complex projects and can work to develop features on your own, right? The other kind is where you work on smaller projects, but with different technologies, right? So for example, you can build the backend of an application with, let's say, Express, and another application with Spring, for example, which shows that you can work with both of these frameworks, plus you can work with JS, TypeScript, or Java, right? It shows that you are capable of learning different kinds of skills, right? What I would recommend is not to get too hung up on what sort of projects to build and focusing more on things that you actually like building, because you're unlikely to want to work on projects that you're not interested in, right? So if it's an application that you really like, feel free to go with the former approach where you add features onto it or refine it. If you're not too thrilled with the project outcome, you can move on to another project and try some new technologies, right? So hopefully that answers Ken's question. Let me see, I was going to answer this. Okay. Copying from the, okay, so do you own the code submitted to GitHub, or is it automatically open source? Great question. So short answer, no, it's not automatically open source. It depends on what sort of license that you put in your file, or in your project, I should say. So for example, let's see if they have the license here. So license.md, this shows the license for the software that you're working with, right? So depending on what sort of permissions you want to give other people to your code, you can modify this license, and you can find templates for different kinds of licenses online. All right, let's see what other questions we have in the chat. Let's see. I guess this is a similar question. Is Microsoft legally able to use the code from GitHub as it is a subsidiary? Again, it depends on the license for your repo. So if you allow them to use the code, then they will use it for machine learning. But if you don't allow it, they won't use it. Right. Okay, there's a lot of questions around whether the links will be shared. I think Catherine shared the slides link in the chat.
Yep. And we will include that with the video in the email that you'll receive after the event. And the video will also be on YouTube.
There's another variation of the question that Ken asked. So is everything just as valid in the eyes of employers when weighing, say, an e-commerce site versus a weather application? Again, just because something is an e-commerce site and another one is a weather app doesn't tell you anything about their complexity, right? So for example, weather.com is technically a weather app, but it is immensely complex, right? And e-commerce sites, they can have different levels of complications or complexities as well. For example, let's say you have a local mom and pop shop, they have a website, and then you have Amazon, the complexity of Amazon is orders of magnitude more than the local website or the local shop's website, right? So just because an app does something doesn't tell you anything about its inherent complexity. It depends on exactly how you build the app and what technologies or conventions you're utilizing, right? Stephen asks, if I am working on a large project, is it better to have a bunch of smaller commits as opposed to infrequent large commits? You absolutely should have smaller commits because when you, like I said, you're not developing things alone, right? When you're working as a software engineer, you're going to be collaborating with a bunch of other people, and they're going to be reviewing the commits or changes that you make, right? So if your changes are more granular, it's easier to review and undo as well, right? I think someone asked whether or not you can undo commits, and the answer is yes, you can, which is why you should have smaller commits or like frequent commits so that it's easier to roll back changes. With modern tooling, you do have automated pipelines where they have automated tests and all the fancy stuff, which GitHub does allow. But basically, yes, you should make smaller commits. So it's easier to review, easier to understand, easier to roll back, right? Are GitHub repos scraped by recruiters? I don't know. At least out of all the hiring people I know, no one has mentioned this before. So my friends who are on hiring teams, they mostly work at mid to large size companies, and they haven't mentioned any repo scraping by recruiters that I know of. All right, let's see. Okay, there's a great question from Felipe. What features would you recommend incorporating into a project, especially for self-taught dev? Interesting question. So depends on what sort of roles you are applying for. So for example, if you're a more front-end focused dev, you could potentially build out better components or better UX experiences, if you will. So for example, you can build out more animations and more performant animations. You can try optimizing front-end performance. Similarly, on the back end, you could add things like auth, caching, performance optimization. You can optimize your database. You can use different kinds of databases. So depending on what you do, you have to figure out what database fits your need. So what features, I wouldn't recommend adding features willy-nilly. It's more important to create the feature properly so that it works rather than just throwing a bunch of features on a project, right? One thing I will recommend for pretty much all project is that you add testing, right? Because as a software engineer on a modern team, you will have to write tests. Like I don't know a single software engineer who hasn't had to write tests, right? So you can add unit tests. Primarily, you want to add unit tests. You can add integration and end-to-end tests if your project is complex enough. But every single project has some scope to add unit tests, which will go a long way in showing your potential employers that you know best practices around software development, right? Great question, Felipe. Okay. Okay, there's another great question. If I have a 3-month project developed outside of Git is it valuable to add it even though there's no Git history? Absolutely. You should still create the proper documentation, like I mentioned, like you would have the overview of features, you would have instructions on how to run it, a good walkthrough video, so non-technical recruiters can easily go through it, right? And it also demonstrates that, demonstrates your coding practices. So a technical recruiter can go in and check out your files to see how you solve problems or how you approach problems or how you manage the complexity of your software. I guess Bart was asking about, and what would be the best way to do that? Hopefully, I was able to answer that. All right, there's another great question. Is contributing to open source relevant to recruiters? And are there any resources to help beginners? So I'm trying to find the resource that I always recommend to people. It's a really good, right. So let me reiterate the question because I think this is important and a lot of people have this question. Is contributing to open source relevant to recruiters? So that's the first part. Yes, it can be relevant depending on what sort of contribution you're making to the open source project. So if you make any contribution, it's going to show up in your commit history. If you make significant contributions, you can talk about that during your technical interviews with the senior engineers or the hiring managers, right? So for example, if you were able to solve an issue, like a difficult issue with an open source project, you can talk about your approach to solving that problem. So it can be very relevant. And some companies actually have their projects as open source. So you can, before applying to a company, you can go and try to understand their code structure and even contribute to that project. So for example, development said, this is a company that works with scientific data and makes tools for scientists, right? So, and then they have a bunch of repos as well. So for example, see if you go to their GitHub account, they have these public repos, right? You can go in and you can pick out issues and try to understand or try to solve some of these issues, or you can look at their code as well and contribute to that before, let's say, you apply to them, right? Let's see. There's another question. How can you verify you have privacy set so only invited people can see the code? Okay. So when you create a repository on GitHub, you can make it public or private, right? So if you want to show your code to the recruiters, you would likely make it public. If you're working on something sensitive, definitely make it private, and then you can invite people as needed, right? There are other layers of security you can add depending on what granularity you're looking for. So another question related to open source. Should we have sorry, I didn't finish answering the other question. So the first question was, is contributing to open source relevant to recruiters? So I think I answered that. The next part is, are there any resources to help beginners? There are a lot of resources, but a comprehensive resource that I've found recently is this, howtoopensource.dev. So it's a book that basically goes over how to make contributions, and the author is the author has made lots and lots of open source contribution. He's been doing it for years and years. So there's some really, really great information about open source or how to start working with open source in here, right? Actually, let me add that to the resources. Great question. How do you open source book? Oops. Right. Should we have a mix of personal projects and open source projects we have worked on, or should personal take precedence? I wouldn't say one matters over the other. What matters is whether or not you have actually worked with complex features and are able to use the technologies that you claim to know on your resume. So you can get practice by working either on personal or open source projects, so long as you can explain the technical challenges and how you solve the problem, it should be fine. Because no matter what sort of contributions you make, it's going to show up on your commit history anyways, right? We don't have a lot of time. I'll maybe answer one more question before we end. Ooh, here's an interesting question by Sim. How important is having an amazing project that you're developing versus algo proficiency? Ooh, okay. So both are important, right? And they demonstrate different skills. So for example, if you're building an amazing project, which I assume means you have been working on a complex project and then adding onto it over several months, that shows that you actually know modern development practices and are able to manage and can manage complexities as they come up. Whereas knowing algorithms proficiency shows that you can deal with novel problems, because a lot of algorithm problems require some like core computer science basics. And if you're going to be working as an engineer, those things will come up, especially on modern systems. If you're doing system design, a lot of the algorithms that you use for system design are rely on more simple algorithm that you learn when practicing algos, right? So I would recommend doing both, because both are important. And depending on the company you apply to, one may prefer the project over the algo. So for example, I know some companies like Morning Brew, they ask you to build a project instead of doing algos. Whereas if you apply to, let's say, Google, they're going to have multiple rounds for algorithms, right? So practice both, because both are important for your day-to-day job as well as the interviews, right? So I don't have any more questions. Hopefully this was helpful, and Catherine will send the slides to you. I think she already did send the link a bunch of times, but thanks everyone for joining and for asking all these amazing questions.
So thank you everyone for Zooming in to join us. If you have further questions about Flatiron School, I'm going to drop the link to schedule a chat with our admissions team. As a reminder, you'll receive a copy of the presentation within 3 business days after the event. And if you want to see any of our previous events, you can head on over to our YouTube channel and subscribe. Thank you all so much and have a great day.
Bye, everyone.